Chapter 3. Back at the house, while Grandma settled Mama into the rocking chair in front of the empty fireplace, I sneaked into the bedroom. Grabbing the yellow baby blanket from the dresser drawer, I stuffed it under my shirt so Grandma wouldn't ask what I was doing with it, and took down off the driveway. At the bottom, I crossed the road and continued down the steep path to the creek, anxious to hold my rock baby wrapped safely in the soft flannel. The emptiness inside me was growing again. At first, I couldn't find the V of the twin tree where I had left my rock baby, and my heart started to pound. There were too many rhododendron bushes with their wilting white blossoms and no double tree. Oh, wait a minute. I was much farther upstream. I took a deep breath and slowed down. Following the creek bank, I scrambled across slippery rocks, dodged trees, and stepped over rotten logs. The ground was slick and covered with moss in places I was sure the sun never got to. My shoes were muddy again, but it didn't matter this time since I was wearing old sneakers and blue jeans. Even if I slid down the boulders on my bottom and rubbed a hole in my pants, no one would mind. Finally, I reached the big flat rock and saw the twin tree with the rhododendron bush behind it. My baby rock was there, right in the V where I'd left it. Oh, thank goodness for that. I touched it before I pulled the blanket from under my shirt and spread it out on the rock. Then I picked up the rock baby with my hand, supporting the back, just like I would have held Mary Kate or one of those twin babies, and placed it on the blanket. I wrapped it like a hot dog in a bun and picked it up again. Holding it this way with just a little bit of the rock peeking out of the top of the blanket made it easier to pretend the rock baby was real. I kissed it lightly, then held it against my shoulder. It felt just right. Part of a lullaby kept running through my mind. I couldn't remember the words Mama used to sing to me, but I did remember the tune, and I hummed along with the sound of the creek. I don't know how long I stood there rocking and humming, but at some point I became aware of two noisy cardinals, one a bright red male and the other a brownish female with a red beak, flying around and chattering back and forth. They squawked louder and louder. When I looked to see what was bothering them, there was the same woman I had seen yesterday. She wasn't close enough for me to see her clearly, but I could tell she was wearing the floppy sunbonnet that hid her face even in the shade. The woman carried a basket this time and bent down to the ground every now and then. What was she doing? She couldn't be picking blackberries. It was too early. Besides, berries grew out in sunny spots. The woman moved steadily up the hill, stopping once or twice to pick something up, and then finally disappeared. This time I was going to investigate, but I had to take care of my rock baby first. I unwrapped it, gave it a quick kiss, and placed it back in the V cradle with a little pat. There was no clean, dry place to leave my yellow blanket, so I folded it and stuffed it back under my shirt. Then I was off to investigate the mysterious woman. The bank was steeper here, and I had to be careful not to slide down into the creek. The rush of the water was growing louder, and the air was cooler. I knew this meant I was getting closer to the big waterfall. Scrambling over a few more boulders, I finally came to the outline of the woman's shoe prints in the mud. My own shoes fit into them with room to spare. Dodging a bee buzzing around my head, I followed the footprints away from the creek and back and forth to little clumps of mushrooms. That must have been what the woman was gathering. The footprints led to a wider trail, and looking way to the top of the path up near the road, I spotted a house. Not a big one, in fact, more like an unpainted shack. The closer I got, the more familiar it looked. Then I realized it was the little house across from the road to Tater Hill. I had never approached it from the back before, so maybe that was why I didn't recognize it at first. The tiny house sat just off the edges of Loggers Creek Road. When cars drove by, dust sprayed across its crooked porch and over the broken rocking chair, coating it with a haze of dirty red. For as long as I could remember, that house had been empty, the windows boarded up. Grandpa called it the McGee house. As each summer passed and I grew older, the house seemed to grow smaller and lonelier. Why doesn't someone live in that poor house? I remembered Grandma asking when I was about 8. Something bad happened there years and years ago, she said, but it was long before your grandpa and I moved here to North Carolina. What do you mean, bad? I asked. The investigator in me kept asking questions. I won't add gossip to something I know nothing about, Grandma answered, with that look of her face that meant it wasn't a subject for children. But don't you go near that place on your own. Bobby would know, I remember thinking, and sure enough, he told me. A murderer used to live there at least 30 years ago, and now she's in prison. From then on, I always thought of it as the murderer's house, and now that I knew which house this was, I was feeling more and more nervous and out of breath from climbing the steep hill. Should I keep going? I stopped to think, crouching low to the ground. The footprints led to the back door, and the door was open, but there was no sound of anyone moving around inside. I told myself the woman couldn't be the murderer. She was in prison, or maybe even dead by now. 30 years was a long time. Was the woman even real? Maybe she was a ghost. I hadn't really gotten a good look at her. The footprints were real, that was for sure. My own shoe had fit right into them. Well, I wasn't brave enough to look inside, so I snuck around the outside, hoping I could catch a glimpse of her through the window. But the windows were still boarded up, and there was a stink, old and rotten the way mushrooms smelled deep in the woods where there was no sun. It wasn't the kind of place I wanted to stay around for long. Then the noise started, a banging sound, not like a hammer, but like wood hitting wood over and over and over. I froze. Once I caught my breath, I couldn't get away from there fast enough. At least I was racing downhill instead of uphill this time. It didn't take too long, but my heart was pounding, both from running and from the fear, when I slipped around the back of Grandma and Grandpa's house and across the yard to my swing that hung from the big branch on the hickory tree. If only there were someone I could talk to about the mysterious woman, but I didn't dare tell Mama or Grandma. First of all, they had too much on their minds, and second, I wasn't even supposed to go near there. Even Grandpa might get mad at me for going near the house. The rhythm of the banging wood still beat in my hand as I swayed back and forth on the swing. When I looked down, I remembered my yellow baby blanket. The front of my shirt lay flat against my stomach, and the baby blanket was gone. I can't lose that blanket, I said out loud. Not all those tiny stitches I spent so many hours on, but more than that, it was the only thing I had made for Mary Kate all by myself, and now I needed it for my baby Rock. I tried to remember it falling out while I was running, but I had no memory of that, only of trying to get away from the banging sound as fast as I could. Maybe I'd find it somewhere laying along the road before I got too close to the murderer's house. It would be dirty, probably coated in red dust, but I could wash it. Headed back across the yard and around the side of the house, I ran straight to Grandpa. "There you are, Annie," he said. "What have you been up to?" "Grandpa." I looked at him, ready to blurt out the whole story of the yellow blanket and the mysterious woman in the murderer's house, but I couldn't. Grandpa bent over and tired, much more than 2 days had passed since Mary Kate died. I couldn't make him worry about me being where I shouldn't be. "Yes," Grandpa waited. "Nothing," I muttered, focusing on the ground. Grandma has lunch just about ready," Grandpa said before I could think of anything else to say. "Go in and wash up, and better take your shoes off outside." "Okay." I untied my muddy sneakers, slipped them off, and left them next to Grandpa's work boots. The blanket would have to wait until after lunch. I hoped no one else would find it. While I was washing up, the telephone rang in the hallway. I could hear Grandma answer it. "Oh, Robert, I've been trying to get a hold of you." "Daddy?" In a flash, I was standing next to Grandma. "Can I talk to him?" I asked. "Please, just for a minute." Grandma shook her head and motioned me away. "But I need to talk to him." I was sure just hearing his voice would make me feel better. Grandma covered the telephone receiver with her hand and said, "Go get your mama right now, Annie. She's in the living room. Your daddy's calling all the way from Germany." "But right now," Grandma repeated. "You know how expensive a long-distance call is." There was no use arguing with Grandma. I went to the living room and was surprised. Mama hadn't heard the phone ring. She was sitting in the rocking chair, holding an ice pack to her chest and staring into the empty fireplace. "It's Daddy," I said, and Mama jumped as if I had sneaked up behind her. When Mama reached the phone, Grandma pulled me away with her to the kitchen. I couldn't even stand there next to Mama and try to hear Daddy's voice through the receiver. "They need their privacy," Grandma said, "but I want to talk to him too." "I know, but not this time, not when it's long distance from Germany." "When can I ever talk to him?" "You could write him a letter, dear, and I'm sure he'll write back." I sat at my place at the table and stirred my tomato soup just to have something to do with my hands. Writing wouldn't be the same. I had only written one thing in my journal right after we got here to North Carolina, and I hadn't been able to write down anything since then. So how could I write a letter? If I could only talk to Daddy, I knew he would come back and take us home to Florida, where we could be together again. Things would be almost normal, even though we wouldn't have Mary Kate. Grandpa sat down at the table too, but none of us ate. The grilled cheese sandwiches grew cold on our plates while we waited. "The telephone call will cost a fortune," Grandma said. "Money." Didn't Grandma know that some things are more important than money? When Mama finally came to the table, her eyes were red and swollen again, the only color in her white face. She didn't say anything until Grandma asked what I was dying to know. "Is Robert coming home?" Mama shook her head. "He said he would come home if I needed him. The Air Force would fly him back here, but I told him not to." She covered her eyes with her hand and mumbled, "There's nothing he could do now anyway." "But I want him to come," I blurted out. "I need him." Mama looked surprised to hear my voice. "Annie, it's too far, and he'd just have to go right back again. I couldn't stand if he was home only to..." Mama didn't finish the sentence. Her chin was trembling. I didn't want to see her cry again. Grown-ups weren't supposed to cry. I jumped out of my chair and headed for the door. Before it closed, I heard Grandpa say, "Let her go." Outside, I shoved my feet into my sneakers, tied them as fast as I could, and began to retrace my steps. My yellow blanket and my rock baby. Those were the two things I needed. Then maybe I could think about Daddy and how far he was, and how Mama wasn't Mama anymore. The blanket wasn't in the driveway, and it wasn't laying in the road. Heading steadily uphill, I searched through daisies and tiger lilies and touch-me-nots that grew wild in the side of Loggers Creek Road. A car passed, blowing a cloud of dust around my face. I held my nose, closed my eyes until the car was gone and the dirt had settled. Then I went on looking. I couldn't let myself think of anything but finding the blanket. The murderer's house was in sight when I finally rounded the third hairpin curve. Crossing to the far side of the road, I pretended I was just walking past while I looked for the blanket. Then I turned around and walked back. No sign of that blanket anywhere, and the front of the house was still boarded up, just like the side was. It looked empty, and I didn't hear the sound of banging wood. Maybe the mysterious woman had left. At any rate, I still needed to find the blanket. Taking a deep breath to store up all my courage, I crept back along the side of the house with my eyes on the ground instead of straight ahead. A soft, raspy voice asked, "Is this what you're looking for?"